Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. Just a couple things to note before we get into today's show. If Real Talk has impacted you, we would love if you would take a minute and leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. This is a huge help for us in promoting Real Talk to those who have never listened. And, as always, today's episode is brought to you by our official sponsor, Trivan, builders of custom trucks, trailers, and enclosure buildings tailored to your needs. Be sure to check them out at www.trivan.com. A huge thanks to them for making this conversation possible. Now on to today's episode. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Real Talk podcast. It's Lucas here hosting another episode. Today we have a timely episode for you. We are talking all things Canadian politics, drama on the international scene, of course, with all the tariff wars that are playing out. And we brought in Mike Schouten from ARPA. So thanks for joining the show, Mike. Appreciate having you here.
Yeah, it's good to be here with you guys again.
Awesome. I'm excited for this one. So we'll touch a little bit on your journey with ARPA over the last couple of years. So for any listeners who don't know who Mike is or who ARPA is as well, we had Mike on back, I believe it was episode 64 to talk about medical assistance in dying. We've had lots of other ARPA staff on over the years, but they're just the Association for Reform Political Action, and they are engaged in the political arena in a high level in Ottawa and also across the various provinces as well. So they really have their finger on the pulse as to what's going on. So we're thankful that you could join us today, Mike, and we'll kind of dive into the current political situation, what we can make of tariffs, how should we think about this as Christians in particular. Is it time to pack it in and move to America and just all become Americans? Do we stand and fight as Canadians? Many things to discuss. So stay tuned and stay with us here on this show. But I guess, Mike, just to tee it up so people know a little bit about who you are and what your journey's been over the last couple of years, can you maybe share just how your role at ARPA has evolved over the years, in particular in a leadership role in a big way over the last few years?
Sure, yeah. It's I started with ARPA in 2012, so it's been almost 13 years now that I started working for ARPA. The first half of my tenure was spent solely on the We Need a Law campaign. So that's ARPA's pro-life campaign advocating for abortion legislation in Canada. In 2018, Mark Carney, the former executive director, he invited me to step into a leadership role as a staff director. And that was a good run for a number of years. And then there was, I think in the last 3 or 4, 5 years, been relatively tumultuous in a sense. Obviously, all your listeners will know about COVID. We've heard of that before. So that made work a challenge for ARPA Canada. And then in the midst of all that, I think you and some of your listeners would be aware, and we certainly benefited from their prayers and words of encouragement during a time where our son developed cancer and passed away. And then Mark Carney, the executive director and founder of ARPA, moved on to be with you fine folks over at RP. We went through a period of a time where there was an executive director that it didn't work out, and the board and that executive director parted ways. The board then invited me to step into this role in an interim capacity. I did that for a number of months and then accepted the position as a full-time position. So it's been a huge learning curve for me stepping into this role. I describe it to people as you kind of transition from working in the organization, like on the day-to-day things that we're doing, to working on the organization. And yeah, I think that's been a challenge more because of, I think, my nature. Like I really like working on the day-to-day issues that ARPA Canada deals with. I love being out there with the people and so on. So, but I'm getting used to it. God's been good. It's been a couple of years now in this seat within the organization, and starting to find joy again after, as I said, a period of ups and downs for sure in the last 4 to 5 years.
Wonderful. Glad to hear it. Okay, so we have a prime minister coming into office, a new prime minister after a decade of Justin Trudeau, whom I'm sure you have some thoughts on as well. Maybe we'll get to that at some point too. But can you kind of give us an update for myself, for our listeners on, okay, we're recording this middle of March, and listeners, you're probably hearing this towards the end of the month. So Mark Carney is currently, I believe, what is the term? Prime Minister designate? Is it designate?
Yeah, Prime Minister designate,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, so he's about to get sworn in later this week, if I understand. And so, who is Mark Carney? What does he bring to the table? And what can we expect in the coming weeks and perhaps months? Will the government stand, or is it likely we head to an election?
Yeah, so obviously a lot to talk about through that. So my initial response would be to the last point that you said. I think we're in for an election relatively soon. I think that Mark Carney has everything going for him in the sense of the polls are getting tighter. There is no track record of his work as an elected politician here in Canada. Um, I think that the current situation, as you outlined right off the top, the tariff and trade war with our counterparts to the south, the United States, provides just an excellent opportunity for him to say, "Hey, I need a mandate from the Canadian people. I've been elected as leader of the Liberal Party, but I don't have a mandate from the people to serve as their prime minister, and I want to serve in that role, and I want to take Canada through this trade war and make us better for it." I think that he has a perfect narrative there to go to the polls like as quick as he can. But I do think it's worth in this context also, even like you mentioned Trudeau, like reflecting for a moment, like where we're at in time. Because I think sometimes we get caught up in the moment and we forget, okay, what's life been like in Canada in the past 9.5 years with Justin Trudeau? And the reality is it's like Canada has gotten worse, especially when we think of the issues that ARPA Canada deals with, right? Freedom, gender, and sexuality, life issues. Like Justin Trudeau is the prime minister who brought us legalized euthanasia in Canada. And within 9 years, we've become the most expansive country in the world when it regards that issue. On abortion, some people would say, "Oh, it couldn't get any worse than it was," right? We had no framework, no legal framework for abortion for 30 plus years now. What's Trudeau done to make it worse? Well, sometimes we forget about the summer jobs fiasco, where his government tried to mandate people to sign on their support for abortion in order to accept some federal funding to hire students in the summer. We forget about his attacks on pregnancy care centers and the fact that they just can't stand it, that these organizations get charitable status, these organizations that are in communities helping vulnerable women. So I think that's just a snippet of some of the things that have occurred in the last 9.5 years. That doesn't even factor in Bill 16, which catapulted Jordan Peterson into fame, gender expression, gender identity, to the Canadian Human Rights Code, conversion therapy, constant attacks on our freedom. We can get into this later, but like that bill that ARPA Canada covered last year in their fall tour, Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act, some of this stuff's pretty egregious. So that's where we are as a country. And yeah, in early January, Trudeau was like, "Oh, saw the writing on the wall, so to speak," and was like, "I can't continue," had to resign. And now all we're talking about is Mark Carney. Like, well, Mark Carney takes over where Trudeau left off. And um, I think there's some things we know about him, but there's a lot that we still have yet to learn about Mark Carney when it comes to some of these social issues. And I actually would see that as an opportunity. Like that's a really good opportunity for organizations like ARPA Canada and all our grassroots supporters. Say, okay, if this is the man that God has put in place to be our prime minister at this time, we need to do some work to get to know where does he stand on euthanasia. Is he going to continue trying to expand it, or is he recognize that we need to rein this in? We need to protect vulnerable people. When it comes to gender identity, gender expression, the whole trans movement, where does he stand? Is he going to toe the party line, or is he going to actually, um, express himself in a way that would be more representative of where we're at as a demographic?
He seems
So
like a more pragmatic guy than Trudeau, at least, or maybe that's just because the winds of culture are shifting a little bit back in the right wing direction. Do you get that read as well?
I think the public facing component of the two characters, like Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney, are quite different. Like where Justin Trudeau is like kind of flamboyant. Remember when he came into power, it was all like about his socks and being on Vogue magazine and all that kind of stuff. Like I don't think
Yeah.
Carney has those kind of ambitions. I think ideologically, there's probably a lot more similarity between the two. But I do see Mark Carney as yeah, how would you say it? Like a more stable character than Justin
Hmm.
Trudeau. He's married, he's got 4 children, seems like he's Roman Catholic, which doesn't mean a whole lot. I mean, it's similar to Trudeau as well, but yeah, he seems like a stable person in that sense.
Yeah,
And I
more
think his,
competent at least.
yeah, and obviously his track record in education would speak to that, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
He was also, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but he was a close advisor throughout the last 4 to 5 years on
mhm.
climate, perhaps economic policy, and closely tied into climate change. Correct?
Yep, yeah, certainly, and it goes back even prior to that, right? Like he
Okay.
was working along with Jim Flaherty, who was Prime Minister Harper's finance minister.
Oh wow. Okay. Yep.
So he's been involved in the financial economic picture in Canada for quite some time already, for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, yeah, like I said, there's not a lot we know about him. My colleague Levi Minderhout, he recently wrote an article. I think this week it's probably posted on the ARPA Canada website. So he read through, Carney has a book that he published in 2011 called, or sorry, 2021, called Values. And yeah, that Levi does a good job in the article about just, what do we learn from his book about him as a person, about his worldview, about how he perceives problems in the world and the solutions for those problems. And I think, but when I read Levi's article before it was posted, he talked about three main issues that Mark Carney digs into. He calls it the triple crises of credit, COVID, and climate. And and I think the solutions that he proposes for those problems are, yeah, they're different than we as Christians would propose. They're more like the state is the one who's going to come in and solve all this stuff. But yeah, it's hard to really get a good gauge on what he's going to do as prime minister. And I think quite honestly, it's going to be a huge learning curve for him. Like
Yeah.
going from, being an economic advisor to a politician who's probably, in the next couple of weeks going to be into a federal election. Like that's a whole different world, right? When you're getting into that adversarial nature of politics, and you and your viewers would know how politics has changed, where it's just like soundbite after soundbite. All they're doing is trying to get the gotcha moments. It's a pretty challenging road ahead for him for sure.
Hmm. Actually, just to take a quick sidetrack on that, the soundbite comment there. So I noticed ARPA, you guys have been doing some longer form podcast style videos that have been on YouTube and whatnot. At least that's where I've come across them. And we were talking off air before we started about Pierre Polyev going on Jordan Peterson's program a few times, and it seems to be a bit of a shift. Certainly, we saw it in the states in the 2024 election with politicians going on podcasts and kind of moving into this longer form style of journalism. Do you see that as a continuing trend, and is that something that you're that brings hope, at least from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it will continue.
Yeah,
But I mean, it will continue until people don't like it anymore. It seems to be something that, yeah, Canadians, Americans, whoever they are, they actually appreciate that type of like receiving their information that way.
yeah,
I'm sometimes still quite surprised that people will sit down and watch or listen to a podcast for 90 minutes, or in Jordan Peterson's case, like 3 hours, or Joe Rogan. Like
yeah.
these are really long conversations, right? But I think what people like about it is that it's less scripted. It's more just real. Like this is the person, this is who they are. They're speaking off the cuff. They appreciate that, and that's the feedback we got for the podcast that ARPA did. We did them just associated with elections. So I did one with my colleague Levi on the BC election last fall, and then a few of my colleagues did it on the Ontario election just a few weeks ago. It ended just a few weeks ago, more just to give people like, okay, what do people, people who are involved in politics full time, what are they thinking about these issues?
Hmm.
And yeah, there's just a genuine appreciation for that. The other reason I think it is something that I hope does continue is because it, especially here in Canada, allows people to kind of circumvent the traditional media and just go speak to the people through that mechanism. And yeah, I think people appreciate that. Okay, there's not, an editor or a journalist who's just putting their own spin on it for the sake of the newspaper. So yeah, I do think there's benefit there that people are just getting it straight from whoever's speaking it. It's not getting screened or
Yeah.
filtered through another mechanism.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's nice. You get to see a different side of the politicians, at least. I mean, again, they're still politicians, so there's a camera going, so it's only so real. But yeah, if you're on, like, for example, yeah, a 3 hour show like Rogan's, that's it's tough to fake it for that long. So
Yeah. It was interesting, just as a little bit of a tangent. Like, so you might have seen your viewers might have seen Wesley Huff from Apologetics Canada was on Joe Rogan, and I met Wesley just this past weekend at the Apologetics Canada conference in Abbotsford here.
cool.
And after he did that 3 hour podcast, he actually did a podcast with just Apologetics Canada podcast with Andy Steiger, where he kind of just actually corrected about a whole bunch of the mistakes that he had made, right? Because he was like, "Look,
Okay.
you're just in the moment. Like there's certain facts you got wrong." So he just was like, "I just needed to correct the record here." And no, I just thought interesting. It's like again spoke to that, like it's just a conversation. And yeah, in conversation, sometimes you get something wrong, you get a fact wrong, or you get a certain thing that's been yeah misrepresented. So
Yeah, it's a fantastic opportunity though. Like it's really cool to see how he can go on a show like that and reach millions. It's he's blown up like so quickly. Okay, switching gears or kind of circling back actually to we were talking about Trudeau before. So the whole situation around the proroguing of Parliament and then basically being leaderless in terms of the feds for the last few months. Is there any like precedent for this, or like does ARPA have anything to say in this regard, or is this a little bit kind of outside of the scope of the topics that ARPA would typically cover?
like you mean prorogation itself?
Prorogation
That
itself, the precedent, yeah, for just not having that leadership in a time where, like, ethically, at least if you were to ask me, I would have said, like, yeah, you got to go to the people, and it's a poor sign of leadership on Trudeau's part.
yeah. Yeah, I think it's pretty unfortunate that as a country we've been in this situation now for 5, 6 months. In fact, you could even go back to the start of last fall's session of Parliament in September, when you might recall that really nothing got done because the
No,
Conservatives were after, they wanted to know, right, where's the money going to the so-called Green Fund? Like, where's it going? And the Liberals were not willing to give it. And then we had the whole foreign interference scandal, and information was so short and forthcoming from that as well. So no parliamentary business really got accomplished. Bills didn't get debated, like it was just at a standstill for the entire session. And then we go into the Christmas break with all this uncertainty about is Trudeau going to resign or not. He waits until January, and then obviously we get the threats from Donald Trump as far as the tariffs. So it's pretty unfortunate, like that we didn't have an election last fall at some point and have some, whether it's liberal or conservative, but a stable government in place to walk Canada through this. So,
what kind of business was on the agenda, and what kind of died with the proroguing of Parliament?
oh yeah, that's quite a bit actually. Like there was
Yeah,
a lot of bills that were in play. I think it's important to note that so most people will understand, or if they didn't, then when Parliament's prorogued, it's kind of like it just gets suspended. And essentially, anything that's being debated at that time, what they call dies on the order paper. So it has that effect, except there are exceptions. So bills that have gone through the process of the first hour debate, second hour debate, they've been to committee, they've been accepted or adopted at committee. Those bills that have been accepted or adopted at committee, they're allowed to be engaged again right away when a new parliamentary session comes into play. So
hmm.
theoretically, if Parliament comes back on March 24th, as what that's the schedule, then there are a couple of bills that can just be picked up right where they were left off. So one of the key ones, I'm mentioning that because one of the key ones that we've been tracking is Bill C 270. So this is the bill to deal with verification and access to pornography online by minors. So, some of you might recognize the name Arnold Pearson. I think a lot of your viewers would. So he's been a big proponent of that bill. So that bill they had completed the committee stage, so it's allowed to be picked up where it was left off.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so that's good. But there's other bills that died on the order paper. Some of them were good to semi-good. Some of them were downright bad. So we're glad that they would have to be initiated right from the start again, the initial step. One of them is the Online Harms Act. So again, I referenced that earlier. ARPA Canada had that as featured in their fall tour. So this act had some good components. Like it touched actually on age verification for minors when it came to accessing pornography, but it also had really bad components dealing with hate speech, the prospects of actually criminalizing people for speech that they might incur or might produce in the future. So it had some really bad components. We're very thankful that that was a bill that seriously impacted Canadians' freedoms. So that's a good one. There was another bill combating human trafficking, so that would have been a bill that ARPA was tracking, and it was a step in the positive direction. So that one's off the table. Then on the euthanasia front, we talked about euthanasia and mental illness a lot. There's another component to the euthanasia debate dealing with advanced care directives. So there was a bill in the Senate dealing with that. So that bill is died on the order paper. So that's a good thing because we don't support advanced directives for euthanasia. There was an anti-spanking bill that's kind of had a little bit lesser importance, but it was a bill that was running concurrently in the Senate and the House of Commons. It's Bill C-273, which was in the House of Commons, and Bill S-251, which is in the Senate. So sometimes senators and MPs will, they'll work together and introduce the exact same bill in both houses just to raise the level of importance, if you will. So this was a bill seeking to amend the Criminal Code Section 43 in regards to corporal discipline, which we weren't in favor of that bill. So we're thankful that it's again been kicked to the curb for now. The other important aspect when it comes to all this, and I did want to highlight this because ARPA's involved with many other organizations in communicating with the government in regards to the budget and the recommendations that have come up to the Finance Committee in regards to charitable status in Canada. I'm not sure if you've seen anything from us, but we put out a call to action a couple of weeks ago because they were actually consulting Canadians. So there was an open forum where you could fill out a survey in regards to your thoughts on this. But yeah, there was a recommendation that came out to the committee, and it was essentially from the BC Humanist Association. They had pitched it to the committee that was facilitating input for the budget, and they recommended that they actually take out the promotion of religion as one of the criteria to qualify for charitable status. So that would impact like 40% of the charities in our country, and really not a good thing. It also had a recommendation when it came to pregnancy care centers and their charitable status. So this was flagged by one of our fellow stakeholder organizations, and we had a few kind of strategic meetings just to figure out, okay, how do we respond to this? So a lot of communication has been going to the Finance Committee, the Minister of Finance, as they deal with this. That's something that is not, so that has not died on the order paper. It was no bill. That's kind of parliamentary business that will come up again as either Mark Carney or another prime minister, if there is an election, have to put forward a budget for 2025. So that's one to really keep an eye on as we go through all of this other saga. I think that while it's alarming, we should note that the Minister of Finance doesn't have to accept the recommendations. So just because a recommendation comes up doesn't mean that that's going to happen. But what is alarming is that it actually made it this far. Like that's part of the alarming. So it shows you, I guess where Canada's at insofar as the movers and shakers and what they're pushing for when it comes to the finances in our country and how it relates to charitable organizations.
How does it get to that stage? Like, how does one get a recommendation to the finance minister? How does that work?
Yeah, so that I'm not clear on exactly all the steps, but they would solicit input from Canadians, from organizations. So it would kind of be like I don't know if it's an ad hoc committee or if it's an official committee, but that they would field input, they would vet it, and then decide what. So this committee is made up of MPs and senators from all parties, and then they would send that up to the actual Minister of Finance. Like, here's our official recommendations based on all the input we've received from Canadians.
Oh yeah, and they
Yeah,
put it out to their stakeholders. So then, if
yeah,
you're a left wing MP, you're a humanist, whatever. Yeah, okay, I got it.
yeah.
It's all coming back to me now from my time in Ottawa, how this stuff works a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different factors at play for sure, but I think,
Yeah,
yeah, to emphasize how it's troubling that it didn't come to this committee and the committee's like, that's
yeah,
ridiculous and just toss it in the garbage. They
yeah,
actually decided and voted together to forward it up.
yeah. Crazy. Wow. Okay, well, we'll stay tuned on all of that. So, just a few things going on.
Yeah, there's quite a
That's
bit going on.
yeah, that's great. Appreciate that update. Okay, so for all intents and purposes, there's a very good chance that we do end up in an election sometime this spring.
Hmm.
And obviously, one of the key issues is our relationship with the Americans and tariffs.
Hmm.
So we could go a ton of different ways on this topic. I'm sure listeners will be, yeah, a variety of opinions on this one as well. It's kind of a tough one to pin down because it's not one of these standard issues where that we deal with in the social conservative wing of politics, where typically we're all kind of aligned as Christians, at least like conservative Christians, quote unquote, biblical. But this one is definitely more in the economic realm, and you can make a pretty good argument, honestly, I would say, from both ends of it. So, with that in mind, I guess I have a couple questions. Let's start with this one. Is there actually a serious threat to our sovereignty with all of Trump's threats right now, or do you think this is more just a negotiating tactic from your standpoint, just given, yeah, as a keen political observer?
Hmm. Yeah. I think it's probably a bit of both. Like, obviously, everybody knows Trump and Art of the Deal, and his negotiation style seems to work. So there has to be part of the motivation has to be that.
Yep.
I think that initially, I, along with many other people, when we first heard this comment about 51st state, we're just kind of like, oh, it's just one of the kind of crazier things that you hear said, and it's going to go away. But it didn't go away, and it's like, oh, it keeps coming up, and then you hear JD Vance talking about it. It's like, wow, okay, now more and more people on the American side are talking about it, and now the Canadian politicians are having to take it seriously, where initially they just sort of scoffed at it or ignored it as well. So I think that to your question, there is a bit of both, because the reality is, and I think most people would readily acknowledge this, like it could happen. Like the states could take over Canada. Like, what are we going to do, essentially?
Not much, no.
So that could happen. I think more and more people, even on the American side, as this trade war continues on, are recognizing that, oh, maybe this isn't actually a good thing insofar as our relationship with our neighbors, for them to the north, for us to the south, as far as how it's impacting families economically. So I think the tide's going to turn pretty quick, where people are like, just let's stop this. This is ridiculous. It's not helping anybody
Yeah.
in the current context. But to Canada becoming the 51st state, I mean, it would just be such a huge violation of all, like, um, you know, I don't know, in the global context, our understanding of sovereignty of a nation and their ability to do things as they have decided. Even we were talking before the show a little bit about, like, is it even scriptural or biblical for one nation to just go into another nation and do what they want to do?
Yeah.
Or should we be respecting their sovereignty and just taking care of our own family, so to speak, and leaving that family to take care of themselves? So
Hmm.
the reality is that when you think purely pragmatically, and I'm not going to say that this is a good um, indicator of how we should think as Christians. We shouldn't think just purely pragmatically. We should always think, like, what are the principles here at stake, and what does God's word have to say specifically, or in principles through God's word about this context. Pragmatically, though, I mean, there could be a business case made to take over Canada insofar as all of our natural resources, just in pure geographical footprint within the world. It's like, okay, now we own this. Gives you access to Europe way quicker, access to Russia way quicker, etc. Like, so there's a lot of advantages. I think somewhat facetiously, someone like Trump probably doesn't realize some of the problems he might be taking on if he would take on Canada, as insofar as we do have a province called Quebec, which could cause lots of issues. We certainly haven't gotten very far when it comes to uh, the relationship with Indigenous peoples in Canada and the
Yeah.
strife that can occur because of that. So, I mean, there's a lot of issues he would be taking on as well. But that's just on the pragmatic side. I think I've really myself and people I talk to just really try to encourage them to think a bit more scripturally about this when it comes to who are we as Canadians, right? I think of in God's word, Jeremiah 29, the letter to the exiles, right? So God's people had been displaced to Babylon. And Jeremiah, God through Jeremiah says to them, like, seek the welfare of the city to where I have placed you. And we often, within the context of ARPA and the Christian community, the Reformed Christian community, will reference that and say, like that is motivation for us to get involved in the affairs of what's going on here in Canada, to help make it better, to be a salt and light here to make it better. And simply because someone can make a pragmatic case that, oh, we'd be better off if another country just took us over and we are just like them. It's like, well, no, no, no. We have work to do here in Canada. Like our grandparents, our great grandparents, many of them came here as immigrants from countries around the world because they saw it as a better place to be, a country where they would be free to raise their families, to build churches and schools and start their own business and get involved in the affairs of Canada. And just because that has been eroded somewhat, some would argue a lot, doesn't mean we say, oh, looks better there, so let's go there, or let's have them just take us over, right? Like I was trying to think of an analogy, and you always could get at fault by thinking of analogies for everything, but um, my background's in horticulture, so you learn a little bit about me there. Like I loved working in the greenhouse industry, and if say someone, a family owned a local greenhouse and they didn't have an exit strategy, they knew what they did and why they did it, but they didn't really have a long-term vision. And another larger greenhouse company came along and said, "Hey, we love what you guys do. But clearly you don't have a long-term vision. Like, can we just absorb you and you just become part of our company?" Like some families might be like, well, yeah, the business case can be made. This now we have a plan. Like we know what we're doing. But we're not talking here about just like an economic profit generating business. We're talking about a country. We're talking about a land that we came to and helped form, a land that was built on Christian values, a land that has parliament buildings with Bible passages etched in it all throughout. Are we willing to just say, oh, they have more freedom down there, so sure, just take us over. Like we'll become like them. Or do we actually want to fight for something here in Canada and continue to be involved in the affairs of what's going on here for God's glory? So I think these are things that we need to wrestle with as we, sometimes I would say flippantly just toss out. And I've heard it too around the coffee table or fellowship halls at churches, like where some people are just like, oh, sure, yeah, he sounds way better than the guy we've got in power anyway. So like, okay, so say just for argument's sake, we do that. What happens in 10 years when the Democrats are in power in the states and things aren't as good? Are we just gonna like jump to the next country and the next one? Like, and I think of that and say that because I want us to really think deeply about why we are here in this context and what our role and responsibility is here, and to focus on that rather than seeing something that's a bit greener over there and jumping uh, and something in that context that's susceptible to the same kind of changes as we've experienced here in Canada.
Yeah. Yeah, it just seems like the easy way out to go, okay, let's just get taken over and like just to roll over and die on it. Like I think there is a good there is a good basis to our country somewhere deep down. Let's go find it again, but it is worth having as a separate country, and there is a bit of a different vision there too, right? Like peace, order, and good government is different than the pursuit of happiness, and there's a slightly it's not radically different, but it's there's a difference nonetheless of yeah, this just almost there's a lot of things I admire about the American ethos, don't get me wrong, and they produce some incredible companies and products, and like they've changed the world in many different ways. And you know, God has used the people of that country for good in a lot of instances, but it also is easy to go too far in that direction. And there's a spirit. Maybe I'm just talking out of my league here, but it seems like there's a spirit of independence there and pride that can almost be just too much and ungodly in some ways. And I think Canada at its best strikes a balance, a lot more reasonable balance in that regard, at least to be slightly more egalitarian. No, not socialist or communist. We have gone in a socialist direction, no doubt, and that needs to be corrected, in my opinion. But I think there's a reasonable basis there to have a prosperous, flourishing country where God can be honored once again, and we can yeah, just have a beautiful place to live. I mean, it is a beautiful place to live, but it needs to be run much better. I think it's worth fighting for as Christians, and it's just simply, I think it's just the easy way out to just flee to the U.S. and do that. But
Yeah.
it might piss a few people off if I say that, but that's how I feel individually, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm at a similar place in a sense. But I think that, so talking about then, okay, well, what is the right response to what's going
Yeah,
on as Christians? I think like the right response is to be like, oh wow, like we've come to such a place where our fellow brothers and sisters even might think, oh, that's the easy way. Like you said, the easy way out. Let's just go there. But
yeah,
no. We actually have to dig in and think about why did our grandpa and grandma come here, our Opanoma? Well, they
yeah,
came here because they saw opportunity, and they actually did really well with that opportunity, not just economically, but getting involved in the economy of the land, getting involved in the setting up of schools and churches. I would say that the moral fabric of Canada has been touched by Christians, not just like we've been founded on Christian principles, but Christians have come here and had great influence in our country. And I think we need to get back to thinking that way, but then also encouraging our leaders to act in that way. Like you mentioned socialism, we need to go back to some of the more basic principles of just, the government's role is to ensure that as individuals and families, we have what we need to flourish. And a big part of that is in Canada, like, what are we doing with our natural resources? How are we
yeah,
blessing each other with our natural resources? How are we blessing people around the world with them in such a way that can alleviate poverty in the developing world, in countries where people don't have near the same access to all the luxuries we have? How can we help them flourish as well? Right. So here's where obviously we don't put our hope in politicians, but you referenced Jordan Peterson before, maybe I mentioned him, but some of you yourself, I think you've seen it. Some of your viewers may have seen the podcast he did with Pierre Poilievre, where Pierre Poilievre actually really gets it, like as far as what's the role of government and what's the hope that we can have, not in government, but the hope that we can have in accessing and using and stewarding the creation, the gifts that God has given us to His glory for our good. Um, I think that there's just so much opportunity in our country, and
yeah.
if we all leave, then it's not going to help matters, right?
Yeah, and if we leave, like who's gonna stay? Like it's just yeah, not people who are gonna get the job done and build up the country, right? You're gonna be left with the
Yeah,
people who you didn't like and they put in the rules that you didn't like, so you left, and the rules got even worse. And you know, you turn into Argentina in 100 years or something, right? Like it just
yeah,
slides.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the tariff situation broadly. That's our relationship with Americans, broadly speaking. We want this to be a little bit evergreen, so we won't get into the weeds on the individual tariffs and whatnot, although that is an issue too. But I guess maybe just on the concept of tariffs in general. Now I know
Hmm.
ARPA doesn't always, or does a little bit in the economic sphere, but that's certainly not the majority of what you guys focus on. Is there a position from ARPA, or is there any literature out there or thoughts out there published about tariffs? Like, how can we think about tariffs? Because the pro case is obviously protecting the home turf, protecting your citizens, but also that comes at a cost, right? So, how have you guys thought about tariffs, especially over the last few months?
Hmm. Well, I think so. You're right in the sense that we don't dig into this very much at all. So on economic issues, we've done a little bit, but really not much. So that like I'm not the best person to to either defend or promote the use of tariffs. I have a relatively good understanding of why they're using them and the benefits that they think it will bring to their own country insofar as being autonomous and being able to do provide for their citizens without having to access it from other countries. But yeah, as far as I mean, I'm seeing the real world impact it has on people and businesses. So there's a lot of uncertainty. But I also sometimes wonder if it is a we talked earlier about a tactic from Trump, right? Just
Yeah.
like a negotiating tactic. And I think that that appears to be a big part of it. Like right now, I find it even hard to discern, okay, what tariffs are in place and what aren't. Because the amount
Oh,
of times you hear like, oh, there's going to be this tariff. And then the next day, oh, no, it's not going to be till then. And then Doug Ford says he's going to put a tariff on electricity. And then 24 hours later, it's like, no, no, it's not on there anymore. And it's like, what actually is being tariffed right now? I don't know. I find it hard to discern. And
yeah.
it seems like a very fluid situation, but it's having the impact of just creating all kinds of uncertainty.
Yes.
Right. I was talking to somebody recently in the like development world, like property development, real estate, and so on. And they were saying, oh, it doesn't day to day really impact what we're doing. Like we're not impacted, but it certainly is impacting in his mind. He was finding it was impacting his longer term decisions because he's like, if I make a decision today that something in 2 years is going to get initiated, then what's going to change between now and then as far as confidence in the economy? And so it's just, yeah, just it seems to be just creating a lot of noise and uncertainty, but I don't know how it's impacting people's pocketbook like today. I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. No, fair enough. Fair enough. That's a complicated issue, and it would be nice to know what the end game is, but that's for anybody to guess to get inside that guy's head. Okay, maybe we'll shift gears a little bit to look at some provincial matters. So here in Ontario, we just had an election a few weeks ago. Doug Ford gets reelected, basically kind of a status quo situation. But hey, he's gets another 4 years, so congrats to him for what that's worth. What are you looking towards next 4 years? Maybe start with Ontario, but then shift to some of the other provinces in terms of meaningful provincial legislation that we should be aware of as Christians, both
Mhm.
perhaps in the positive sense and also some stuff to be concerned about as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, so Ontario is good to talk about because we're right at the beginning of a new mandate for Doug Ford. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about, I think, would relate to various other provinces as well, and some of our ongoing efforts there. So I think there's three things that come to mind for Ontario. One is like Ontario still has a really, really bad family law policy. We highlighted this quite a few years ago when it was Kathleen Wynne's government that brought it in, but it's essentially like the province of Ontario allows four-parent families, people that aren't even in any kind of relationship. They're just listed on documents. They have all kinds of like nonsense when it comes to parent one, parent two, parent A, parent B, like not even mentioning father, mother, and all that kind of stuff. So it's something that we've done some work on with Ford in his previous mandate. Didn't really get anywhere yet, but it just seems somewhat ridiculous that we can have a conservative provincial government that allows this kind of family law policy to stay in place. So that's
Yeah,
one area that we're going to hope to see some change and work towards seeing some change. And most of that would be done with our direct advocacy. Like a few of my colleagues have pretty good relationships with a lot of MPPs and staffers at Queen's Park, and we've been building those relationships. There's trust being built there and so on. So hopefully we see some action on that. The other two that are pretty key are going to be the treatment of minors who experience gender dysphoria and what we do in order to treat that. And will we continue to allow in Ontario prescriptions of puberty blocking medication, cross hormone therapy, even surgical procedures to treat gender dysphoria? So we've been and we're going to continue pressing in Alberta with our Let Kids Be campaign to get the Ford government to actually acknowledge that something that was done in Alberta by Premier Smith also needs to be done in the province of Ontario by Premier Ford and his government, and that's protecting minors from these. So outright banning those procedures and treatments for minors who experience gender dysphoria.
quick
So
clarifying question on
yeah.
that. So the current situation in Ontario, the law is that's it's legal for which age? Like how old could you be to get gender reassignment surgery? And then I'm assuming that's also publicly funded as well.
Yeah, so it's all publicly funded. The surgical component usually is the last part of the treatment, and that
Okay.
would obviously occur um, most of the time when minors are mostly developed in
Mhm.
that sense. But the puberty blocking medication starts as young as 10, 11 years old.
Wow.
Cross hormone therapy can begin right after that. So we're talking very young ages. It's hard to get the actual data as to how many
Yep.
this is occurring to, but we know it's happening. It's not illegal, so it's legal. It's happening in the
Yeah.
province of Ontario. It's not happening anymore in the province of Alberta because in
Yep.
Alberta they passed three different bills that address this topic of medical transition for minors. So yeah, that's a big one in Ontario that we're going to want to yeah, continue working with the grassroots so they understand this issue and they're bringing that to the attention of their local MPPs. And then we're working at the direct advocacy level to convince policymakers at Queens Park that they can and should introduce this type of legislation and hopefully earlier on in their mandate. And then the third
Great.
area that we're focused in on, this applies to Ontario as well as to various other provinces, is in what provincial governments can do to protect vulnerable people from euthanasia. Because euthanasia, while it's a criminal code matter, it's in the criminal code, federal issue. It's administered within the confines of a healthcare system, which provincial governments have control over. So there is multiple things that can be done at a provincial level to protect people from euthanasia, including protection of minors for very much the same reasons as you would protect them from some of the things we just talked about when it comes to gender dysphoria, protecting minors if that becomes legal in our country, but then also in how it's administered, mostly in how it's administered, like how many people need to sign off on this, where it's administered, working with them to ensure that there are actually euthanasia-free hospice zones, if you will. So the province where I'm from, I'm not sure if you're aware, but like the NDP government in their last mandate, they mandated that every palliative care or hospice facility, doesn't matter if it was Christian or not, they had to facilitate euthanasia.
Wow.
And in fact, Delta Hospice Society, they had to close down because they were not going to bend on that.
Yeah.
So they closed down. So it's it's getting pushed really hard through the healthcare system. And there's lots of opportunity for us to work there at that level of government, provincial level, to try
Okay.
to put some protections in place. But those would be the three. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Is there any financial, like extra financial incentive on top of like the people who would be pushing euthanasia for moral reasons, or is it all just part of the public health and there's no extra financial incentive there?
Can you clarify, like how do you mean financial
Oh, okay.
incentive?
So like if there was any sort of company involved in pushing euthanasia, like say
Yeah.
whatever, I supplied I don't know, the I'm not even sure how they do it actually, honestly, like a needle or there's probably a couple different methods perhaps, but if
Yeah.
I was
There's
involved,
medication. Yeah.
medication, yeah. So if I was involved in the supply of that, I would be pushing for more and more of that if I didn't oppose it morally, which I suppose I wouldn't if I was supplying the things needed for euthanasia. So do you know if there's any background pressure from that way? Because it seems like how quickly it's moved, like why so quickly? I don't think the population, I mean, obviously Canadians are kind of seems like they're on board with euthanasia as a general concept, which is sad, and you guys are working on changing that, and that's something we'll keep praying for and working on. But
Hmm.
to go this strongly and not even allow the option for a palliative care facility to exist that doesn't offer that, that seems like such a strong push. Like, is it just an ideological thing, or do you think there's a monetary incentive there as well?
Hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's no evidence that I've seen that shows that, for example, a company that produces the medication that kills the patient, that they lobby the government to expand euthanasia. I haven't seen any evidence to that. So
Yeah.
I would imagine there's some money to be made when it comes to the production of that medication.
Yeah.
But most of the lobbying, the advocacy from the pro euthanasia side is done through an organization called Dying with Dignity here in Canada. They're the ones that, in fact, right now, actually, they're spearheading another court challenge to the euthanasia laws as they currently exist to expand it even further. So yeah, there it comes from those proponents, and essentially it's a worldview clash. That's what we're dealing with here, right?
Yep.
Where people want to have autonomy to make these decisions on their own. And then you combine that with a world that, because of the fall into sin, we have suffering. And we, as a country, collectively, we don't know what to do with suffering anymore. And this seems to be an easy way out from suffering. So many people are selecting it because it's an easy way out. And it's done under the guise of healthcare. And I think we need to differentiate there between euthanasia and assisted suicide. So in Canada in 2016, when we legalized this, we legalized both euthanasia and assisted suicide. So euthanasia is actually when a doctor kills the patient. Assisted suicide is when the doctor prescribes the medication that will kill the patient, but the patient is obliged to take the medication themselves. So just to give you an example of the contrast here, so
Okay.
California as a state has pretty similar population numbers. I don't know exactly, but similar to
Yeah.
Canada.
Yep.
They legalized euthanasia in the exact same year, actually, and but they only legalized assisted suicide. And the numbers of people who avail themselves of that in the States are a fraction of what they are in Canada. Like
Really?
they're in the hundreds. And the numbers in Canada, the latest ones we have in 2023, it was over 15,000 people. And it's about like 96% of them are euthanasia, not assisted suicide. So
Hmm.
to make this real, so if you're a suffering patient in your hospital bed
Yep.
and a doctor says to you in California, you've requested assisted suicide. Here's the glass with the medication in it. You drink it, and an hour later you'll be dead. Um, Not many people can do that. Like it goes against the natural law, I think, that God has placed on all our hearts to actually kill yourself.
Yeah.
But if you're that patient in a hospital bed and you have your family all around you and the doctor's there and he's just administering medication like you would any other medication that's supposed to be for our good, for our benefit, but this
Yeah.
happens to kill you, you sign up for that in a heartbeat because the doctor's just
Wow.
treating you, right? So there's like this kind of this psychological component to it, to the
Yep.
differences between euthanasia and assisted suicide. So yeah, in Canada we have both. Like I said, nearly all cases are euthanasia. They're not requests for assisted suicide; they're requests for euthanasia. And so I think that because of that, people see this as like it's kind of this benevolent thing that the government's allowed to happen that just helps us deal with our suffering.
Yeah.
And the challenge is for us as Christians, we know that suffering is part of the human existence.
Yep.
But what does God's word say about suffering? God's word's very clear that suffering, God brings suffering to bring us closer to Him,
Yep.
right? Like this is Old Testament and New Testament. You think of the refiner's fire in the Old Testament. You think of the adversity of the early church and the apostles in the New Testament. Suffering was to bring them closer to God, to make them more and more into God's image bearers. And yeah, I think that there's huge opportunity for the church in this context. So I work for ARPA Canada. It's obviously a political organization, but sometimes hard to differentiate on some of these issues. Not differentiate. I shouldn't say that. It's hard to separate the political response and the pastoral response. Like
Hmm.
there has to be both.
Yeah. We're completely missing a theology of pain or suffering,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Which is, yeah, you see that in a lot of different areas of life, but it leads people to look for outlets or to look for the ultimate easy way out.
yeah.
But one of those outlets would be gambling, which I wanted to talk to you about that as well. And
Oh wow,
that's,
hard shift here.
yeah, no, that was a little
Okay.
transition there, but hey, it connected. I tried to be smooth. But yeah, no, the issue of gambling. So this is going back to some of the provincial ones we were talking about, right?
Yeah.
So we see it. I mean, we see it across the country. I would imagine. I don't know. Yeah, if you're watching hockey in BC, you're probably getting similar ads for
Oh yeah.
all the
Yeah.
betting sites. Yeah, it's nuts. Like it's everywhere, and it's becoming. I think it's becoming a pretty big issue in the church too. Like the draw is there all the time. Speaking as a young guy who likes to watch sports in general, but hockey in particular, like it's a constant pull all the time.
Yeah.
It's advertised and pushed so hard, and you could see it in the stats and the numbers in terms of the size of these gambling corporations, whether they be private or government backed as well. and all the money that flows into that. So, from a provincial standpoint, because I think that would be the area that this will be addressed in,
Hmm.
is ARPA working on any legislation, or are there background efforts being made to try to mitigate at least the advertising of all this gambling? Because I think it's having a serious negative effect on our country, and then also in particular even inside our churches for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so not a lot. And it is something that we're starting, like, to hear you speak to it. We hear it more and more as well, and obviously see it all. Like, I can't even open my Sportsnet app on my phone and get a
Yeah, no,
bet GM or bet MGM ad or something. Yeah, it's like ubiquitous in society. It's
yeah,
everywhere. Um, we did a little bit of work in Ontario in the province. So you're right, it is a provincial matter in the province of Ontario. There was a bill introduced in, I think it was in 2023 from the NDP actually introduced a bill, um, prohibiting, it had to do mostly with advertising. So that stuff you see like on the Sportsnet app when you watch a hockey game, to kind of rein that in, like just how it's everywhere. The advertising's everywhere. So that bill didn't go anywhere. It was a PC government. They didn't vote in favor of it. So that's something that could receive our attention, I think. On the topic of like gambling and addiction, most of our efforts are on the pornography side. But being somewhat familiar with Life Renewal, just put a little plug in there for Life Renewal. Great program. Went through it myself. A lot of times people will go to that because that's their vice. That's the thing that they need to get under control and be free from. And it's, yeah, like you said, I think it's no wonder because I'm a sports fan too. And when you watch sports, like you think you know quite a bit about it, right? So you're
oh
like,
yeah,
okay, oh yeah,
yeah,
I know who's going to win this game. This
easy
guy's
money.
injured. He's injured
Yeah,
tonight, so they're going to win for sure. Like,
yeah,
yeah. And obviously with the advent of smartphones and so on, it's so easy. It's
yeah.
so easy to. What I have started to notice, I don't know, maybe you've seen it a bit more as well in Ontario, but when the ads come on, they always have a disclaimer at the end, either about like a cap on how much you can bet, or the age thing for sure, and make sure you're aware of provincial guidelines and rules when it comes to gambling and so on. But
Yeah.
it's pretty loose, and the appeal is huge to it.
Oh, it's the
Yeah,
stupidest thing ever. Like they'll advertise the snot out of it, and then they'll show McDavid with some other guy and be like, "Hey, there's tools to help you if you get a problem from all our
yeah,
advertising. Like,
yeah.
we'll suck
I
you in,
know.
and then yeah, you can pay
Yeah,
to go get some help." Like,
yeah.
yeah, it's a
I
trap.
know. It's like giving you a candy and then punching you when you come and get it. It's like
Yeah, no,
both at the same
exactly.
time.
Yeah,
It is actually interesting that to talk about this. Like, I don't talk about gambling very much in our work context for sure. But back in like my first introduction to ARPA Canada goes back to 2003, and that by at that time ARPA Canada as it exists today didn't even exist. It was just
okay.
local chapters, and I was part of the local chapter in Surrey. And one of the first things that we dealt with then was gambling, because there was a horse track in Cloverdale, and they wanted to bring in a casino to the horse track.
Ah, okay. Yep.
Yeah. So then it was like I remember some of the arguments we were putting to the city council at the time to not give it a permit,
Yeah.
had to do with the addiction component, but a lot of it had to do actually then with like how it would impact the neighborhood and the
Yeah.
culture around that area. But it's changed so much from then, where yeah, you just sit on your couch and you can be gambling away, going into debt, just dollar after dollar.
Yeah. I
So
mean, it's a separate debate, I think, to say whether or not it should be allowed in general. But I just think the promotion of it is nuts, and I think that's got to get
yeah.
limited.
So that's what that NDP bill was in Ontario. So kudos to them for recognizing
Yep.
the harms of it.
Yep.
So that, yeah, no, that's a good reminder. Actually, like it should be something we could touch on a bit more through the work of ARPA.
Yeah.
It's one of the challenges. There's so many topics that you can tackle, right?
Yeah. No, you guys got your work cut out for you. Yeah, limitless, really. Okay, cool. One other thing I want to shift into is so we talked about the federal situation. We talked about the provinces, a couple different things to keep an eye on in that front. Is there anything
Yeah.
going on in the Canadian courts of any various level that we should be aware of as listeners here?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's lots actually. There's been quite a bit of action in the courts. So for your listeners' benefit, ARPA Canada, that's a part of the second part of our mission is to bring a biblical perspective, like to the legislatures and to the courts.
Yep.
And most of the time in the history of ARPA Canada, when we engage in the courts, it's as like an intervener. So just to quickly describe that, so at a court level, you'll always have two parties that are they're on different sides of an issue, and they need a judge or a panel of judges to adjudicate that and come to a decision. Oftentimes, in those cases, the judge or the panel of judges will accept third parties as interveners because that will help them. That's the case we make. Our perspective will help you come to a decision on this matter. So
Yep.
most of the time, ARPA is an intervener or collaborates with other groups to form a coalition of interveners, etc. There are some times, though, when we actually initiate court action. But that's a different level of seriousness for us as an organization. Like essentially, you're suing the government. So how does we say we respect the government and so on is going after them in the courts? Is that something we should be doing? We think we can do it, but we have to be very careful and make a good case for it. So I'm prefacing what I want to say with that, so you understand where we're at. But last year in 2024, because we had a really neat victory when we initiated court action, actually. So that was in the city of St. Catharines, which I think you're familiar with the city of St. Catharines.
Yep.
And so they had passed a bylaw in 2023 prohibiting the distribution of material that had fetal images on it. So quite a bit of the material from the We Need a Law campaign actually has like ultrasound images or that what's become kind of iconic, that circle with the baby in it in utero that we have. So that we wouldn't be able to distribute those in St. Catharines anymore. So we actually initiated legal action against the city, saying this violates freedom of expression, prepared for the case, and we're ready to go to court 3 weeks prior to the actual court date. The city of St. Catharines Town Council, they met with their lawyers, and their lawyers advised them, based on the arguments that we had put forward, that you're not going to win this case, like you're going to lose. So the city actually repealed the bylaw. They took it off. They repealed it, and were allowed to distribute the material. So it didn't set a legal precedent because it didn't get heard in court, but it set a political precedent, which is really, really cool. So, and then a bonus was that we sent out a press release highlighting this victory that we had. And there were two other towns in Southern Ontario that were contemplating the same kind of bylaw, and we haven't heard anything about that bylaw since then. So that's just to share. I find it really encouraging to share success stories where God blesses the work with fruit. So that's just really encouraging. But then, yeah, there's some other cases that we've been involved in. One was in BC, was Jehovah Witnesses case, where it had to do with church discipline. So, obviously we don't align with Jehovah Witnesses when it comes to ideology and worldview, but the implications of the case would have the potential to impact Reformed churches as well.
Yep.
We were involved in Ontario, the CHP. There was a case there. So again, these are as interveners. The CHP had an ad. I think the ad just said women, and then colon an adult female. It was like a big transit ad. Just had a picture of a woman. So it was like against the trans movement, right?
Yep.
And it got yanked. So we intervened in that case. That case got lost. It was lost at the first court level, and it's now at the Court of Appeal. So we track it right through then. I think I touched on already. There's a case at the federal level. Dying with Dignity is the biggest organization in Canada that promotes euthanasia. So they're challenging the mental health exclusion. So currently, right now, people with mental health issues as the sole underlying condition are not allowed to avail themselves of euthanasia. They're challenging that. So yeah, like we think it's bad, right? And then you have cases like this that they're like, it's not bad enough. We need to make it worse, and they're gonna try and make it worse. So that's one that it's not in motion yet, but that's one that we would be seeking to intervene in as well. There's a case there's a little town called Emo in I think it's northwestern Ontario. So there's a little town there. It's near what's that city? What's that city when you go from Winnipeg to Thunder
Kenora.
Bay? Kenora, yeah, somewhere near there.
Okay, yeah.
Um, so the town council, this goes quite a few years back, they had received an application to declare like Pride Month, and have a parade and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
there's a local pride group called Borderland Pride there that didn't like that. So they filed a human rights complaint, and they actually won. They won the human rights complaint. The mayor and the town council were ordered to undergo like re-education training and things like that. And the town council has said, forget it, like we're not taking this. So they've applied for a review from the actual courts. Like, so the Human Rights Tribunal is not an actual court, right? So they've now applied for a review from the court, the Ontario Superior Court, to review that. And
Yeah.
that case as well will accept interveners. So we applied there as well. So that's just a couple of the ones that to highlight. John Sycama, our director of law and policy, him and his team do a really good job of just surveying where things are at. And I think that it's well, the neat part about that work that we do as ARPA Canada is I feel like we're always often doing it with a lot of other organizations like Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. Sometimes Cardis gets involved in that kind of work, just in collaboration and strategizing. Christian Legal Fellowship, like who's taking what argument are you going to make? Okay, we'll make this one, we'll apply that way. So I think that that's helpful for sure. Yeah.
All right, very cool. Yeah, I forgot about that emo case. I was just googling it as you said it there, but that's interesting. So that lives on because that's been going for a number of years now, right? Been working
Yeah.
its way through the courts. Yeah,
Yeah.
cool. All right.
Yeah.
Um, Another question I had for you. It seems like you guys have had great success with the youth movement becoming engaged in ARPA chapters across the country. Do you want to speak to that and maybe like the God and Government Conference as well?
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's actually so exciting to see
Yeah.
youth getting involved. Yeah. Like there's so many ways I find that we're able to now. We have a couple of years ago, Daniel Kennis, a former employee of ARPA, our IT web guy, he developed this leaderboards competition. So where mostly students get involved, they compete against each other. So when they complete a political action, like sending in a postcard or meeting with your MP or your MLA, you get a certain amount of points. So it kind of build it into a contest to just add a level of competition there. So that's been exciting to see the number of youth and school clubs get involved in that. But then we also annually now hold 4 youth conferences in the fall. So in Alberta, BC, Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario. And those are very well attended. Between 80 and 100 youth sign up to attend those, and they're usually a Friday afternoon and a Saturday. So that and involve workshops, action out on the streets, just a lot of fun together as youth, but around a kind of a political conference. And then we just actually held, you mentioned God and Government Youth. So yeah, we just held that this past spring, right at the end of February in Ottawa. So that's a quite a like a signature event for us, these God and Government events, and take a lot of investment, but the benefit is incredible. Like to hear and see the youth come in on the Tuesday, kind of nervous, like it's a big city they come to, they're not sure what to expect, and then 3 days later leave, hugging each other, tears in their eyes, just the experience that they had, getting to know different people, but also getting a real sense of what life would be like to work for ARPA, be involved a bit more in politics. And then, so we hadn't done one actually for 5 years because COVID interrupted the whole pattern that we had developed. But recently, we've actually had 2 staff work for us that went to the 2020 God and Government Youth. So
Hmm.
they were involved in their local school clubs. They went to the God and Government Youth Conference, and then when the job opening came up, they applied for Canada and got to work with us. Like so, it's just really neat to see that, right? Like again, that's fruit on the work. I think youth in particular in today's day and age, like they want purpose. They want to do something that's meaningful. And
Yeah.
if they get a little taste of that through some of the involvement and touch points with our Canada, then they start to think, oh, this is something that you can actually do as a job.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just been wonderful to see that. I think the one thing I will highlight is that sometimes it's a bit disappointing that when we have these events, the male to female ratio is completely skewed. Like we had at the God and Government Youth event in Ottawa, we had 36 participants, but only 8 of them were guys, and all the rest
Mm.
were girls. So
Okay.
there's probably various factors that go into that, but I think as we look at ARPA chapters, we have quite a few of them across the country. A lot of them are they're all volunteers, but they're staffed by females as well. So just putting a plug in there for guys, like it's good for guys to be able to step up and see this as a responsibility and something that they can do as well. So just wanted to share that because I mean, obviously we're overjoyed with the number of youth that are involved, but it'd be great to see some of these high school kids and college students that get involved with the work at ARPA as well.
Oh, guys, that's a pretty good ratio of guys to girls going to a conference like that too. So for any of the
Yeah,
young ones out there,
but
that's good.
even some of the guys actually, I mean, they might be like, "Oh, well, this is great. We get to hang around with a bunch of girls all week."
Yeah,
But they commented that, "Oh, it'd be neat if there was more of us here, like more guys. Like, where's all our brothers?"
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah,
Oh, okay, cool. Well, time to step up. It's I'm sure it's fantastic. Okay, couple closing questions here. You mentioned a few new members, and people that you had hired who went to God and government. Are there a few new positions over the last number of years, and people that are filling those positions that you want to highlight, or any changes over the last number of years, like different
yeah,
managers or anything like that?
yeah. There certainly has been some change. I think that yeah, it's like we've undergone a bit of a transformation. If you think back 5, 6 years, where if you'd ask people who were the front-facing staff at ARPA Canada, it'd be like, oh, Mark Penninga and Andre Schouten. Well,
Yeah,
both of them are no longer with us,
yeah,
and it's been neat to actually see some of the staff like Levi Minderhout and Daniel Sackville and Teresa Wanya step up. Right, it's an opportunity for them to take more of a lead role, and I think that's I always say to the staff, I think it's actually been really good, like the transition. There's obviously been challenges that come with it, but it's been good in the sense that it really is about the mission. Like it's not about one person or another. It's about the mission.
yeah,
And Mark was always really big on that. Like he
yeah,
was like, ARPA can't be about Mark Penninga. It's about ARPA Canada, the mission: educate, equip, and encourage Reformed Christians.
yeah.
That's what it's about. So yeah, there have been some changes. We probably the biggest change to highlight would be last year when our colleague Ed Hogerdijk went down. So he was the grassroots director and just a fantastic colleague, like as a person, but just so good at being an ambassador for ARPA at grassroots events, at schools, fall tours, etc. Anyway, he's been obviously called to a different journey now, taking care of his son Zach, who yeah, just had a debilitating medical emergency that has changed his life forever. So Ed is his full-time caregiver. I stay in touch with him regularly. He is doing well, so praise God for that. But yeah, we had to find somebody to replace him. So yeah, it was a pretty robust application process. We had lots of people interested. We had two really good applicants, and we ended up choosing Paul Lawton. So he actually lives in Peterborough. So it's about
Okay,
2.5 hours from Ottawa and 2.5 hours from Southern Ontario. He lives there with his family and attends the Bowmanville URC, I
okay,
think it's the Salem URC in Bowmanville. That's what it is. So just northeast of Toronto.
yep,
And yeah, it's been a really good addition. Yeah, middle-aged guy with life experience, passion for the work, really good connections with a lot of people already that he's been able to bless our work because he's reaching out to other organizations, other churches, Reformed churches, Presbyterian churches, and yeah, it's a learning curve for him, but we're super excited that God provided somebody to fill Ed's shoes. Totally different kind of person, but somebody who's already been blessing the work of ARPA Canada. And then we have yeah, we have a new administrative assistant here in BC. I find that position there's a fair amount of turnover. That it's always a bit cumbersome, just like any business or organization. When you get new staff, it takes a while to onboard them. So we
yep,
have a new Marcus Niels is a new admin assistant here. And
yep.
then we also hired in Ontario Naomi Meerstra as a kind of Eastern grassroots coordinator. So that's been pretty neat to see. Some of you may have seen her. She's on quick updates a fair bit and so on. And
Yep.
just a lot of energy for the work and a real neat ability and gift to connect, especially with youth. So she's been working in the schools quite a bit, doing presentations at Redeemer and local Christian high schools and things like that. So that's pretty exciting to see. And again, she's new at the work, so it's going to take a while for her to really get to a place where she's comfortable and flourishing, but it's off to a great start. So I think in general, when it comes to that question that you have, I always just find it fascinating how, yeah, people want to work for ARPA Canada. Like this is so great that God has blessed the organization with stability, with financial support, that we're able to keep executing the mission and maintain the staff that we have. And they're people who, yeah, just want to bring God glory through bring His word to bear in the political realm. So really exciting.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's great to hear that it lives on despite changes in personnel and whatnot. The mission lives on. So, one final kind of closing question, I guess. So, what for vision for the future, specific, I guess, to ARPA, but maybe you can touch on Canada in general if you want to. What is what does political action look like for ARPA? What are some things on the horizon? Do you guys have any goals that you're setting in terms of either policy you'd like to influence, or are you guys looking to grow or scale to different provinces? What's on the horizon for ARPA, and then maybe for the political scene in general, if you want to comment on that as well.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, good question. So as far as like we definitely do goal setting and yeah, 1 3 year goals and so on, the big audacious goals and that
Oh
kind of
yeah,
thing. A
can you
lot of
share that or
them,
no?
yeah, I think so. Like our big audacious goal is that of all the NAPARC churches in Canada, we have
Yeah,
at least five like points of contact, like meaningful points of contact. So not just a name and an email address that doesn't do anything, but five people in each of those churches that are actually involved with our work regularly. So
wow,
that's a pretty big goal, but it
yeah,
actually gives us some focus when it comes to, okay, so we need to reach those churches. We need to be meaningful and intentional about yeah, either connecting with them via video calls, going to those areas, doing presentations. So this we've done quite a bit already this spring on that, reaching outlying areas. I'm going to be in Southern Ontario in a couple of weeks with my colleague Paul, going to a couple of URC churches that are just in outlying areas that we just never get to. They never really get to hear us face to face. So go there, build those relationships. The East Coast is another opportunity. So part of Naomi Mearster, I just mentioned her, part of her role is to yeah, to help us build bridges into the East Coast. There's quite a few ARPs, OPCs, even the CRC to some degree in Eastern Canada and the Maritime provinces is quite receptive to our work. So yeah, that's another opportunity. But actually, a big focus is trying to use what we already have, what God has blessed us with finances and staffing resources, human resources, and become more efficient, but also more intentional about like who we're trying to reach and how we're trying to grow. And while we're doing that, you know, asked like, what are some of the challenges? Maybe I think that what we're increasingly noticing is that, especially in the reform community, there's a lot of things vying for our money, a lot of things vying for our time, just a lot going on. Where people kind of sometimes have to choose between there's every night there's two or three events. So which one do you go to? What's going to have priority? And yeah, when I'm out and about, I really people are really helpful to give their input and assist us in understanding like where people are at. And there's a ton of support for ARPA, but sometimes people are just like, look, we had two other things that we got invited to tonight, and we had to choose, so we chose that one. Doesn't mean we don't support ARPA. We just couldn't come this time. What we do know, and this is what gives me not gives me hope per se, like in the big word hope, but what gives me
yeah,
optimism, I should say, optimism is that when something matters, then people show up. It's really neat to see, like when you know there's a bill in play, or when it's like, hey, this is for example, one example. I'll just give a local example here in Chilliwack, BC. There was a by-election for one of the local school trustees had ran for provincial politics, and there was an empty seat. So it's something that like 2 to 3% of the population get engaged in, like when you see the number of votes.
yeah.
But the local ARPA chapter took it upon themselves to be like, no, let's get all the churches in Chilliwack to know about this and keep pushing it. Like, this is the date, this is where you got to go. Here's the profile on the two candidates. And there was quite a few, like a lot of people voted, and the candidate that they would have preferred got in. And it's like, okay, like that was really good. So it was something that was really time bound, and there was a sense of urgency there. People get engaged. Like then that will become their priority for that week or for that day. So ARPA has, in 17, 18 years of existence now, built a good enough trust with the Reformed Church in Canada that when something happens and you need to get involved, like they'll just do it, right?
Yeah.
So to know that we have that being built, even though they're not always engaged, they might not always show up to the fall tour, they might not always respond to your emails. They're there, they're watching what's going on, and they're ready to get engaged when they recognize, okay, now's when we got to do something.
Yep.
So that's really encouraging. I think another one of our biggest challenges is to continue to foster that optimism, because it's so easy to, like we talked about earlier, right? Do we just run to the States because it looks better there?
Yeah.
Like it's easy to give up. There are a lot of things that have gone, yeah, I would say, things that have worked at crumbling, at etching away our foundations, and that can get you down. But I think it also, as Christians, we have to see that as opportunity. We remind ourselves so many times, like if things seem to be getting darker, then we should be shining brighter. Like we're God's light into this world. So how are we doing that? And there's so many opportunities to do that in the political realm. And that, we have to ensure that people are continually reminded that we don't do this work because God has promised some kind of great result here in Canada within the next 10, 20 years. We do this work because he's already won the victory, and we want to live a life of thankfulness. And part of doing that is being obedient, and being obedient to his call to be a salt and light, to be his voice for truth here in the country. And I think that, tying back to that passage in Jeremiah, seeking the welfare, like that just comes to mind. Like we need to seek the welfare of the city that God has placed us in. And if people are looking for ways to do that, they're going to come to ARPA Canada for how to do that. And when we put to them, like this is the time when we got to do that, the response is just incredibly positive. So,
Well said. Great to hear that. And yeah, thank you for your time, Mike. Thank you for your wisdom on today's show. Really appreciate that. And yeah, it's been a pleasure, and the Lord's blessings on all your work with ARPA.
yeah, thank you. It's been a good conversation. Keep it up with the good work that you guys are doing as well. I hope that Real Talk continues to grow and evolve, and just be something that people go to become educated, to be encouraged, and as we help each other move on here in Canada, it's God's church.
Yep, definitely to inform and to encourage. End it on a positive note there. So, listeners, thanks for sticking around and listening to the end of the show. And if you have any questions, concerns, you can always send it in to reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. Happy to take any of that. And if you have any disagreements or comments, feel free to send it in, and maybe we'll get Mike back on in the future to discuss. So, till next time, keep having real talk.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. In partnership with Reform Perspective, this show is created and produced by Tyler Vanderwood, Lucas Holtfleur, and Mariah Tamiga. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen or watch the show. If you have any feedback for us or ideas for future guests or topics, please let us know. You can reach us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. Be sure to also follow us on social media. You can search Reformed Real Talk on any of the platforms. We should come right up. Also, leave us a review, preferably a 5-star run, on any of the podcast platforms. That would be greatly appreciated. That's all for now, folks. Keep having real talk.